Today, we're diving into the birth of a nation, Israel. It's a story that's full of ancient dreams and really modern politics, of imperial promises and, well, brutal realities. This is a story that really began with two competing visions for the exact same piece of land, and that set the stage for a conflict that, as we all know, continues to shape our world.
You know, this sentence just perfectly captures the whole paradox of Israel's founding. On one hand, you have the world of diplomacy, right? All the backroom deals, the big declarations, and lines drawn on maps by empires thousands of miles away. But on the other hand, you have that baptism of war, the raw, violent struggle on the ground that would actually forge the nation's borders and its identity. This tension, it's the key to understanding this entire story. So to get our heads around this, we're going to follow a really clear path. We'll start with the spark of the idea itself. Then we'll see how it got tangled up in an empire's big gamble. We'll walk through the chaos of the British Mandate, look at the final moments of partition and war, and then, at the end, we have to confront the competing histories that still echo today. Okay, let's start with the idea. The dream of a modern Jewish state didn't just pop out of thin air. Nope, it was forged over centuries of displacement and persecution, and it all came together in a powerful political movement that would literally change the course of history. For almost 2,000 years after the Romans kicked them out, Jews lived as scattered minorities all over the world. This was the Jewish diaspora. But in the 19th century, something new and ugly took hold in Europe, a racial form of anti-Semitism. It led to these horrific massacres called pogroms in Russia. And then there was the famous Dreyfus affair in France, where a Jewish army captain was totally framed for treason. All these events sent a chilling message, even in so-called enlightened countries, just trying to fit in, to assimilate. It wasn't enough. For a growing number of people, the only real answer was to have a nation of their own. And this feeling, this conviction, gave birth to a political movement, Zionism. It wasn't just about religion. It was a modern, nationalist answer to all that European anti-Semitism. The goal was crystal clear, and it was urgent. Establish a sovereign Jewish homeland in the ancestral land of Palestine, also known as Zion. And the person who really put this whole idea into overdrive was Theodor Herzl. His book, The Jewish State, was basically the blueprint. And his powerful declaration, "The Jews who wish for a state will have it," that wasn't just wishful thinking. It was a promise that absolutely electrified the movement. And it led to the very first Zionist Congress in 1897. The dream now had a political engine. So, the idea is born. But for that idea to become a reality, the world map itself needed to be redrawn. And the event that did that? World War I. The Ottoman Empire, which had been around for 400 years, was crumbling, and Palestine, a land it had controlled for centuries, was suddenly up for grabs, turning it into a game board for a new imperial power. And this is where the story gets incredibly tangled. As the Ottoman Empire was falling apart, Great Britain saw a huge opportunity. They were desperate to win the war, so they started making promises about what would happen to Palestine. The big question is, who exactly were they making these promises to? And right here, this is the absolute core of the conflict. To the Arabs, Britain promised independence, and they believed that included Palestine if they just revolt against the Ottomans. That was the McMahon-Hussein correspondence. But then, at almost the same time, Britain's Balfour Declaration promised the Zionists its full support for a national home for the Jewish people in the exact same land. They essentially promised the same territory to two different groups. It was a disaster waiting to happen. And that brings us to the inevitable next phase, a mandate in chaos. After the war, the new League of Nations basically handed control of Palestine to Britain, and their job? To somehow manage the collision of the two totally incompatible promises they had just made. From day one, the British Mandate was an impossible balancing act. They were supposed to help create a Jewish national home, while at the same time protecting the rights of the Arab majority who already lived there. These weren't just competing goals, they were on a total collision course. The result was, well, tragically predictable. The whole Mandate period was just a powder keg of escalating violence. You had riots in the 1920s that just exploded into a full-scale revolt by the late 30s. By 1947, the land was engulfed in conflict. Britain was exhausted, and they basically just threw up their hands and said, "We're done," and handed the problem to the rest of the world. So what was fueling all this fierce resistance? Well, for the Palestinian Arabs, the reasons were pretty clear.
They saw massive Jewish immigration, called Aliyah, changing the very fabric of their country. They watched as Zionist organizations bought up huge tracts of land, often leading to them being pushed out. And they saw the British as a colonial power that was actively helping all of this happen, leading to their ultimate fear, becoming a minority in their own homeland. This chaos brings us to the final, violent chapter just before statehood: partition and war. So Britain walks away, and the newly formed United Nations steps in. And the horrors of a world war happening half a world away would now dramatically speed up the push for a Jewish state. Of course, that event was the Holocaust. The genocide of 6 million European Jews during World War II created this overwhelming wave of international sympathy. It wasn't the original reason for Zionism, but it acted as a massive catalyst, strengthening the moral and political urgency for a Jewish state to exist as a safe refuge. So the path from there was really swift and decisive. An exhausted Britain hands the whole mess to the UN. The UN solution? Resolution 181. It was this radical plan to just partition or split the land into 2 states, one Arab, one Jewish. The reaction was immediate and completely polarized. The Jewish leadership accepted the compromise, but the Arab leadership rejected it completely. And a huge reason for that rejection is right here in the numbers. The UN plan gave about 55% of the land to the Jewish state, even though Jewish people only made up about a third of the population at the time. So from the Arab perspective, this wasn't a fair split. It felt like a deeply unjust plan that gave the majority of the land to the minority of the population. But despite the Arab rejection, the Zionist leadership decided to press ahead. On May 14, 1948, literally as the last British soldiers were leaving, David Ben-Gurion declared the State of Israel independent. But the celebration, it was very short-lived. The very next day, 5 neighboring Arab armies invaded, and the war for Israel's survival and for Palestine's future began.
The outcome of that war was an Israeli victory, but it came at a staggering human cost. Around 700,000 Palestinians were displaced from their homes and became refugees. For Palestinians, this event is known as the Nakba, which means the catastrophe, and it marks the central defining trauma of their entire national history. And this brings us to our last and maybe most crucial point: these competing histories. You see, the war that was fought with guns in 1948, it never really ended. It just continues today as a war over the story itself, with the exact same events being remembered in radically different ways. So in the Zionist narrative, 1948 is the triumphant War of Independence, this heroic return to an ancestral home. In the Palestinian narrative, it's the Nakba, a catastrophe of settler colonialism, dispossession, and ethnic cleansing. And then, in recent decades, a third view has emerged from historians, including many Israelis, called the revisionists. They've used newly opened archives to paint a much more complex picture, one that talks about forced expulsions and really challenges those traditional national myths. And this just begs a final, critical question. How is it possible for one event to be remembered in such profoundly different ways? Well, it's because for the people involved, history isn't just something in the past. It is a living, breathing reality. For one side, it's the foundation of their country and their security. For the other, it's the very source of their statelessness and their dispossession. So in the end, the birth of Israel wasn't just a single moment in time. It was this explosive end to a century-long process, a powerful nationalist dream, the cynical gambles of a dying empire, and the tragic clash of 2 people's claims to one small piece of land. And what it left behind is a legacy of unresolved questions about history, memory, and justice that continue to echo incredibly powerfully to this very day.